Marcus Chen wiped down the counter of his food cart for the third time that evening, watching the last of the dock workers shuffle past toward their bunks on the far side of the spaceport compound, and the twin moons of the colony world cast long shadows across the landing pads where freight haulers sat dormant until morning. He had been running this cart for nearly 5 years now, ever since the accident that took his daughter Sarah away from him, and the work kept his hands busy, even if it could not keep his mind from wandering to darker places during the quiet hours between shifts. The War spaceport on Reach Station 7 was small by galactic standards, but it saw enough traffic to keep Marcus fed and housed in his tiny apartment above the cart. And most nights, he served simple meals to travelers who needed something warm before heading back into the cold void between stars. Tonight felt different somehow, and Marcus could not quite put his finger on why until he noticed the lights flickering. Along the eastern perimeter fence, where the cargo containers were stacked 3 high and neat, rose power fluctuations had been happening for weeks now, and the station engineers blamed it on solar interference from the nearby star. But Marcus had lived here long enough to know when something was genuinely wrong versus when officials were making excuses to avoid doing actual work. He was packaging up the leftover protein bars and vacuum sealed them for tomorrow when he heard the sound. A sort of chittering hum that seemed to vibrate through the air itself rather than travel through it like normal noise. 3 small shapes emerged from behind a stack of containers, and Marcus froze with his hand halfway to the stub baton he kept under the counter for emergencies. But these creatures did not move like predators or threats. They moved like children, awkward and curious and stumbling over their own limbs as they approached his cart with what he could only describe as hopeful caution. The creatures were reptilian, in basic structure with scales that gleamed in shades of copper, bronze, and deep gold under the harsh spaceport lights, and they stood perhaps waist-high to Marcus on 4 legs that ended in delicate claws. Their heads were wedge-shaped with large eyes that reflected light like gemstones and small horns that curled back from their skulls in patterns that reminded Marcus of crown moldings. And from their backs sprouted wings that seemed far too small to be functional, folded tight against their bodies. The largest of the 3, the one with copper-colored scales, took a tentative step forward and made a sound that was half purr and half whine. And Marcus felt something brush against his mind like a gentle wave of emotion, hunger, loneliness, hope mixed together in a bundle that hit him square in the chest and made him think of Sarah when she was small and would wait up for him to come home from late shifts. With that same desperate patience, Marcus slowly reached for one of the protein bars he had been packing away and unwrapped it carefully while maintaining eye contact with the copper-scaled creature. And he broke off a piece and held it out in his palm the way one might offer treats to a nervous animal. The creature approached with delicate steps and sniffed at the offering before taking it gently in its mouth, and the sensation of pure joy that radiated from it nearly made Marcus laugh out loud. The other 2 surged forward immediately, and Marcus found himself scrambling to unwrap more protein bars while 3 hungry reptilian juveniles crowded around his cart, making sounds of contentment that rumbled in their throats like distant thunder. Over the next hour, Marcus fed them everything he had left from the evening service and watched in fascination as they devoured mineral supplements he kept for the rock-eating species that occasionally passed through. And they seemed especially fond of the crystalline glucose compounds he used for the silicon-based travelers. They did not speak in any language Marcus recognized, but the empathic pulses continued throughout the feeding, and he began to understand basic concepts through the emotional impressions they projected. The copper one seemed to be the leader, or at least the boldest, and Marcus decided to call him Ember based on the way his scales caught the light. And the bronze-colored one with the nervous disposition became Spark for the little flickers of static electricity that danced along her wing membranes. The third with scales of deep Burnished Gold was clearly youngest and clumsiest, and Marcus named him Flare after watching him accidentally ignite a piece of paper with an unexpected sneeze that produced a tiny gout of flame. When they had eaten their fill, the three juveniles began to explore the area around the cart, with Ember leading the investigation of every corner and crevice, while Spark stayed close to Marcus and Flare attempted to climb onto the counter with limited success. Marcus checked the time and saw it was nearly midnight, which meant station security would be making their round soon, and he had no idea how to explain three unknown creatures hanging around his cart when regulations clearly stated that all alien fauna required documentation and quarantine protocols. He made a decision that in hindsight was either the bravest or most foolish thing he had ever done, and began constructing a makeshift shelter behind his cart using empty cargo netting and thermal blankets from his emergency supplies. The juveniles watched with interest as he worked, and when he finished, they investigated the shelter thoroughly before curling up together in a pile of scales and wings and contented rumbling. And Marcus sat on his stool watching them sleep, while wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. Security Officer Lynn made her rounds at midnight and stopped to chat with Marcus the way she did most nights, but her eyes kept drifting to the shelter behind the cart, where suspicious lumps were visible under the thermal blankets. Marcus explained that he was storing some sensitive equipment for a trader who would pick it up in the morning, and Lynn gave him a look that said she knew he was lying but was too tired to care about whatever harmless nonsense he was up to. After she left, Marcus finally allowed himself to relax, and he pulled out his personal tablet to search the galactic database for any species matching what he had just fed. But nothing came close to the unique combination of features these juveniles displayed. He found entries for lesser drakes and pseudo-dragons, and even some extinct species that looked vaguely similar, but none of them had the empathic abilities, or the particular scale coloration, or the odd sense of presence these three carried with them. As dawn approached, Marcus made the decision to open his cart as usual and see what happened, and the juveniles woke when he started prepping for the morning rush and immediately began projecting hunger at him with an intensity that made his stomach growl in sympathy. He cooked up a batch of his special grain cakes mixed with extra minerals, and watched in amazement as Ember used a careful stream of flame breath to toast his portion to perfection, while Spark generated enough static to perfectly crisp the edges of hers. Flare tried to copy them, but ended up setting his cake on fire completely, and looked so devastated that Marcus quickly made him another one while projecting reassurance and affection. Back at the young creature, the morning customers were too busy and too tired to notice the three reptilian helpers behind the cart, and by the time the rush ended, Marcus had made twice his usual profit and gained three very enthusiastic assistants who seemed determined to stay. He knew this situation could not last forever, but for the first time since Sarah died, Marcus felt something like purpose warming his chest, and he decided that whatever these creatures were, and wherever they came from, they needed him right now, and that was enough. 3 weeks passed since the juveniles first appeared at Marcus's cart, and in that time they had become as much a part of his routine as the morning prep work and the evening cleanup, and he found himself thinking of them less as strange aliens and more as the children he never got to raise after Sarah's death. The empathic communication had evolved from simple emotion broadcasting to something more complex and nuanced, and Marcus discovered he could send images back to them through focused thought combined with strong feelings. Ember showed him visions of vast star fields and the cold emptiness between systems, and Marcus felt the loneliness that radiated from those memories like a physical ache. And he responded by sharing memories of Sarah and the warmth of family dinners and bedtime stories. Spark was more reserved, but she communicated through gentle touches of her mind against his, and shared impressions of being lost and afraid in the dark until she found the lights of the spaceport. And Marcus sent back feelings of safety and home, and the promise that he would protect them flare was the most open emotionally, and he bombarded Marcus with a constant stream of wonder and curiosity about everything from the way the food processor worked to the patterns of stars visible through the atmosphere. And Marcus found himself explaining human concepts through a mixture of words and mental images. The juveniles had grown noticeably larger since that first night and now stood nearly chest-high to Marcus when they reared up on their hind legs. And their wings had developed enough that they could glide short distances, though true flight still seemed beyond them. Marcus had moved them into his apartment after the first week when Security Officer Lin started asking more pointed questions about the shelter behind his cart. And he converted his storage room into a nest using every blanket and cushion he owned. The juveniles loved the nest and would pile into it each evening after the cart closed while Marcus worked on his tablet or read old books. And sometimes they would share visions of their dreams, which were strange and beautiful and filled with imagery Marcus had no context for understanding. One evening, Ember projected an image so clear and detailed that Marcus gasped aloud. And he saw a massive shape moving through the corona of a star, like a swimmer moving through water, and the presence of that shape made something primal in his brain scream warnings about predators and dangers beyond human comprehension. Marcus tried to ask what the vision meant, but Ember only projected confusion and a child's understanding of something too big to fully grasp. And Marcus decided it must be some kind of racial memory or instinctive fear passed down through generations. The cards business had indeed boomed once word spread about the entertainment value of watching three small dragons help with food preparation. And Marcus had to expand his menu to keep up with demand from customers who came specifically to see Ember perfectly sear steaks with precision. Flame Control Spark had developed a talent for generating controlled electromagnetic pulses that could quick charge the heating elements and refrigeration units. And she seemed to take pride in keeping all of Marcus's equipment running at peak efficiency. Flair's contributions were less practical, but infinitely more entertaining, as he had appointed himself official greeter and would waddle up to new customers, projecting such overwhelming friendliness that even the grumpiest freight haulers could not help but smile. The only problem was that other aliens had started giving the cart a wide berth, and Marcus noticed Centaurian merchants would cross to the opposite side of the concourse rather than walk past his setup. And the insectoid Resh traders refused to even look in his direction anymore. One night, a grizzled Centaurian hauler approached the cart during a lull in business, and his 4 eyes darted nervously between Marcus and the juveniles, who were napping in their usual spot near the grill. And the alien's translator box crackled to life with obvious reluctance. The Centaurian asked Marcus if he knew what he was feeding, and Marcus replied that they were some kind of rare reptilian species that seemed to have been abandoned or lost. And the Centaurian made a sound that the translator rendered as horrified laughter. The alien leaned in close, and his translator spoke in a whisper that somehow conveyed the weight of terrible knowledge. And he told Marcus that those were not ordinary creatures, but something far more dangerous than any human should be handling. Marcus asked what species they were, and the Centaurian backed away, shaking his head, and all 4 eyes wide with what looked like religious fear. And he said only that Marcus should pray their mother never came looking, because entire star systems had been sterilized for lesser offenses against her kind. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the Centaurian turned and fled back to his ship, moving faster than Marcus had ever seen one of his species move. And the juveniles stirred in their sleep, as if sensing the disturbance in the emotional atmosphere. Marcus tried to push the encounter out of his mind and told himself the Centaurian was just superstitious or misinformed. But over the following days, he noticed an increase in official traffic through the system. Galactic survey ships began appearing on the long-range sensors and station control reported unusual queries from various governmental bodies about unregistered life forms. And Marcus felt a growing sense of unease that he could not quite shake. The juveniles seemed to sense his worry, and Ember in particular stayed close during working hours and would press his wedge-shaped head against Marcus's leg in what had become their gesture of reassurance and affection. Marcus started researching protected species and endangered fauna in the galactic databases, and he found thousands of entries for creatures that were illegal to harm or capture. But nothing matched the juveniles and their unique combination of features. Also found disturbing reports about poaching rings that specialized in exotic creatures for wealthy collectors, and several warnings about slavers who targeted rare species for various black market purposes. And Marcus decided he needed to be more careful about who saw his unusual helpers late. One night after closing the cart, Marcus sat in his apartment with the juveniles curled around him in their usual pile, and he shared his concerns through the empathic link. And they responded with images that chilled him to his core. They showed him ships with weapons that could crack planets and beings of terrible power, who moved through space without suits or vessels, and they projected feelings of being hunted and hiding and the desperate need to stay concealed until something changed. Marcus made a decision in that moment, and he began constructing a hidden compartment in the base of his cart, using materials scrounged from the recycling center. And if officials came for the juveniles, he would smuggle them onto an outbound freighter and get them somewhere safe. The juveniles watched him work with solemn understanding, and Ember projected gratitude so pure and strong that Marcus had to pause and wipe his eyes. And he realized these strange reptilian children had become more important to him than his own safety. Over the next week, Marcus established contact with a sympathetic freighter captain who asked no questions and was willing to provide emergency transport for the right price. And Marcus began setting aside credits from his increased business to fund their escape if it became necessary. Juveniles continued to grow, and Marcus noticed their scales had taken on a deeper luster, and their eyes seemed to contain depths that had not been there before. And sometimes, when they looked at him, he had the unsettling sensation of being seen by something far older and wiser than their childlike behavior. Suggested Security Officer Lin stopped by one evening and mentioned that Fleet Command had issued a system-wide alert about missing juveniles of an unspecified protected species, and failure to report sightings could result in serious legal consequences. Marcus kept his face neutral and said he had seen nothing unusual beyond the normal traffic of strange aliens through the port, and Lin looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy or warning. After she left, Marcus gathered the juveniles and explained through images and emotions that they needed to be extra careful now. And they responded with understanding and a fierce determination to stay hidden that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah hiding from the doctor visits she hated. That night, Marcus barely slept, and he lay awake listening to the juveniles breathe in their nest while wondering what kind of parents would let children this young wander alone through the galaxy. And he promised himself that whatever came next, he would not let anyone take them away without a fight. The morning sky above Reach Station 7 turned dark with ships, and Marcus stood outside his cart staring upward at a sight that would have seemed impossible just days before. And dozens of vessels from at least 15 different species hung in orbit like a swarm of metal insects waiting to descend. Station control had gone into emergency protocols, and all commercial traffic was being diverted to alternative ports while the fleet performed what they called comprehensive survey operations. And Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the search was far more serious than he had imagined. The juveniles had sensed the danger before the ships even arrived, and they huddled in the hidden compartment Marcus built beneath the cart, refusing to come out even for food. And their empathic projections were a chaotic mixture of fear and defiance and something else. Marcus could not quite identify. A broadcast went out across all frequencies in the system, and Marcus listened on his tablet while pretending to prep vegetables for the lunch rush. and the voice belonged to someone who identified themselves as Fleet Admiral Korvax of the Combined Species Protection Authority. The Admiral explained in formal tones that 3 juveniles of a critically protected species had gone missing approximately 1 standard month ago, and their continued absence posed a significant threat to interstellar stability, and any being possessing information about their whereabouts was required by galactic law to come forward immediately. Marcus felt sweat bead on his forehead, despite the cool morning air, and he glanced at the cart where he knew the juveniles were, hiding just meters below the unsuspecting customers who were lining up for breakfast. The broadcast continued with the Admiral describing the juveniles in terms so vague they could have applied to dozens of species, and Marcus realized the authorities were being deliberately unclear about what exactly they were searching for. What chilled him most was the final statement where Admiral Korvax warned that failure to return the juveniles could result in stellar consequences. And the way he said stellar made it sound less like hyperbole and more like a very specific and terrifying threat. Marcus served customers with shaking hands while his mind raced through possibilities, and he wondered if he should come forward and explain that he had only been trying to help. But the juveniles projected such desperate, pleading through the empathic link that he could not bring himself to betray their trust. Throughout the day, small groups of officials moved through the spaceport, scanning everything with devices Marcus did not recognize. And twice they passed within meters of his cart, while the juveniles remained perfectly still and silent in their hiding spot. Security Officer Lynn approached during the afternoon lull, and her expression was grim as she leaned against the counter. And she told Marcus in a quiet voice that the fleet was not leaving until they found what they were looking for. Marcus asked what could be so important about 3 lost juveniles that it warranted this kind of response, and Lynn shook her head while glancing around to make sure no one was listening. And she said that according to rumors, these were not ordinary children, but the offspring of something powerful enough to make entire governments nervous. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main landing pad, where a group of Resh traders were being questioned by armed officials. And Marcus watched as the insectoids were led away for more intensive scanning and interrogation. Over the next several days, the pressure intensified as the fleet brought in more sophisticated equipment and began conducting building-by-building searches. And Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before they reached his section of the port. He activated his emergency plan and contacted the freighter captain, who agreed to create a diversion near the outer docking ring. And Marcus began preparing to smuggle the juveniles aboard. During the confusion, the juveniles had become increasingly agitated as the search closed in, and their empathic projections grew more intense and desperate. And Marcus received fragmentary images of the massive shape he had seen before swimming through stellar fire. He tried to understand what they were showing him, but the concepts were too alien and vast for his human mind to properly process. And all he could grasp was that they were terrified of something finding them, but also desperately wanted that same something to arrive. On the 5th day of the occupation, Marcus was closing up the cart when a figure appeared from the shadows near the cargo containers. And the being was unlike anything Marcus had encountered in his years at the spaceport. It stood roughly human height, but its body seemed to be composed of crystalline structures that refracted light in impossible ways. And its face, if it could be called that, was a constantly shifting geometry of planes and angles. The being spoke without moving anything that resembled a mouth, and its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. And the translator in Marcus's ear identified the language as Ancient Keeper, which Marcus knew was one of the oldest species in the known galaxy. The Keeper asked Marcus a single question in a tone that mixed curiosity with something that might have been horror. And it wanted to know if Marcus understood whose children he had been feeding for the past month. Marcus replied honestly that he had no idea what species they were, and he had only been trying to help what appeared to be lost and hungry juveniles. and the keeper made a sound that the translator could not properly render. The being moved closer, and its crystalline structure pulsed with colors Marcus had never seen before. And it told him that the juveniles were stellarborn, which meant nothing to Marcus until the keeper explained further. Stellarborn were not a species in the conventional sense, but rather entities that existed on a scale beyond normal biological life. And they were born from the hearts of stars and lived for millions of years tending to the cosmic processes that kept galaxies functioning. Marcus felt his legs go weak, and he leaned against the cart for support while the keeper continued its explanation. And it told him that the 3 juveniles he had been feeding were the children of a stellarborn matriarch who personally maintained this entire region of space. The keeper asked Marcus if he knew what it meant that these children had chosen to stay with him rather than return to their mother. And Marcus could only shake his head because his brain had stopped processing information somewhere around the part about being born from stars. Before the keeper could elaborate, the juveniles emerged from their hiding place and positioned themselves between Marcus and the crystalline being. And they projected such fierce protectiveness that the keeper actually took a step backward. The ancient being studied the juveniles with what Marcus interpreted as amazement, and it spoke directly to them in a language of pure mathematics and light. And they responded with defiant chirps and empathic pulses that needed no translation. The keeper turned back to Marcus, and its voice carried a weight of terrible knowledge. And it told him that it would inform the matriarch of the situation, and strongly suggested that Marcus prepare himself for a meeting that would change everything he understood about the universe. After the keeper departed, Marcus sank to the ground while the juveniles crowded around him, projecting comfort and reassurance. An ember sent him an image of the massive shape in the star's corona, but this time Marcus understood what he was seeing. The shape was not a creature swimming through fire, but rather the fire itself, given consciousness and purpose. And the star at the center of this system was not a star at all, but a living being of unimaginable power. Marcus pulled the juveniles close and held them, while his mind tried to cope with the revelation. And he realized he had been feeding and protecting the children of something that could destroy planets with a thought spark, nuzzled against his chest, and projected feelings of affection and safety and the simple trust of a child who knows their caretaker will protect them. And Marcus felt tears running down his face because he had no idea how to protect anyone from what was coming. Flare climbed into his lap, despite being far too large for it anymore, and radiated pure contentment at being near his human. And Marcus laughed through his tears at the absurdity of the situation. He had lost Sarah to an accident he could not prevent and spent 5 years drowning in grief and loneliness. And now he found himself caring for 3 children who were essentially infant gods, while their mother, who owned the very star that warmed this world, searched for them across light years. The night sky began to change, and Marcus looked up to see every ship in the fleet suddenly break orbit and flee toward the system's edge. And he knew without being told that she was coming. Space itself seemed to ripple like water, disturbed by something massive moving beneath the surface. And the star that had shone steadily for billions of years began to pulse with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Marcus gathered the juveniles and brought them inside his apartment because whatever happened next, he wanted them to feel safe. And they curled up in their nest while Marcus woke to silence so complete it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, and the juveniles were standing at the window of his apartment, staring out at a sky that had transformed into something from a fever dream, and every star visible through the atmosphere pulsed in perfect synchronization. Like a cosmic heartbeat, the emergency sirens that should have been wailing across the station were quiet, and Marcus realized with growing dread that every electronic system had shut down simultaneously, and the only light came from the star that hung in the sky, radiating colors that hurt to look at. Directly he joined the juveniles at the window and felt their Emotional projections shift from nervous anticipation to something approaching reverent joy. An ember pressed against his leg while showing him images of reunion and homecoming. Star began to move, and Marcus's rational mind screamed that stars did not move, but his eyes could not deny what they were seeing. And the massive sphere of nuclear fire drifted closer to the planet with impossible grace and deliberate intent. Then space folded in a way that made Marcus's stomach lurch and his vision blur. And standing in the middle of his small apartment was a woman who should not exist. She was tall and slender, with skin that seemed to contain entire galaxies just beneath the surface, and her hair moved like solar prominences caught in an eternal dance. And her eyes were twin supernovas that saw through matter and energy and time itself. Marcus fell to his knees not from conscious choice, but because his body recognized the presence of something so far beyond human that prostration was the only reasonable response. And he felt the weight of her attention fall upon him like the pressure at the bottom of an ocean. The juveniles rushed forward with cries of happiness, and they swarmed around the woman who Marcus now understood was their mother. And she knelt down to embrace them with arms that flickered between solid flesh and streams of plasma. Her voice, when she spoke, was the sound of solar wind screaming across magnetic fields and the gentle whisper of fusion in a star's heart. And Marcus's translator struggled to render her words into anything resembling human language. She asked her children if they were harmed, and they responded with enthusiastic denials while projecting memories of Marcus feeding them and protecting them and making them feel safe. And the woman turned her terrible gaze back to Marcus with an expression he could not read. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat had closed with terror and awe, and he could only kneel there while she studied him with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. She asked him a question, and this time the translator managed to convey her words, though they still carried harmonics that made his bones vibrate. And she wanted to know why he had fed her children when he could have turned them over to authorities for a reward. Marcus found his voice somehow, and he told her the truth, which was that they had been hungry and alone, and he knew what it felt like to lose family. And he could not turn away children who needed help regardless of what species they belonged to. The woman stood, and Marcus realized she was not standing on his floor, but rather floating a few centimeters above it, while reality bent around her presence. And she told him her name, which was a concept too vast for human language, but the translator rendered it as Aurelia explained that her children had wandered off during what she described as a dimensional game, and they had become lost in the folds between spaces. And she had been searching across light years while growing increasingly desperate and angry. Marcus understood that angry in this context meant something catastrophic, and he remembered the Admiral's warning about stellar consequences. And he asked carefully what would have happened if her children had been harmed. Aurelia's expression shifted to something cold and terrible, and the temperature in the room dropped, despite her body radiating enough heat to turn sand into glass. And she told him that the species responsible would have been sterilized down to the last world, and the stars themselves would have been snuffed out as a warning to others. Marcus felt ice run through his veins as he realized how close entire civilizations had come to extinction. And all because 3 children had gotten lost and ended up at his food cart. The woman moved to the window and looked out at the station where millions of beings lived and worked in blissful ignorance. And she said that she had been prepared to burn this entire system to ash in her grief and rage. Then she turned back to Marcus, and her expression softened into something almost maternal. And she told him that instead she had found her children happy and healthy and projecting love toward a small human who asked nothing in return for his care. Marcus protested that he had not been special or heroic, and he had simply done what anyone with compassion would do. And Aurelia made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been the death scream of a star. She told him that in her millions of years of existence, she had seen countless species rise and fall, and very few beings of any kind would willingly care for unknown children, especially when those children belonged to a power that could erase them from existence. The juveniles clustered around Marcus's legs and projected such fierce affection that he had to put his hands on their heads for balance. And Ember sent him images of all the nights they had spent together and the feeling of safety Marcus had provided Aurelia. Watch this display with eyes that contained eons of memory, and she told Marcus that in Stellarborn culture, the care of another's children was considered the most sacred of bonds, and those who protected the young were owed debts that could never be fully repaid. Marcus said he wanted no payment, and he had only done what felt right. And Aurelia's smile was like watching a sunrise over an alien world. She asked him what he desired then, because she could not leave a debt unpaid, and the balance of cosmic forces required acknowledgement of what he had done. And Marcus thought about all the things he had lost and all the grief he carried. He told her he wanted nothing for himself, but he asked that she protect the people of this station and ensure that no harm came to the millions of beings who lived here in peace. And Aurelia studied him with an expression that might have been approval. She asked if he was certain, because she could offer him immortality or power or knowledge beyond human comprehension. And Marcus shook his head, because he had learned that such gifts always came with prices too steep to pay. All he wanted was for good people to be safe, and for children everywhere to have the chance to grow up without fear. And Aurelia's eyes blazed with light that forced Marcus to look away. She told him that his request was granted, and this system would henceforth be under her direct protection, and no force in the galaxy would be permitted to bring war or destruction to these worlds. Marcus felt the weight of her declaration settle over reality like a blanket, and he understood that she had just rewritten fundamental laws of the universe to honor his simple request. And entire governments would learn that this system was now untouchable. Aurelia gathered her children close and told them it was time to leave, because they had cosmic duties to learn and responsibilities that could not be delayed forever. And the juveniles projected sadness, but also understanding. Ember approached Marcus and pressed his wedge-shaped head against the human's chest, and the empathic pulse that came through was a promise of remembrance and gratitude that would last longer than Star's spark curled her tail around Marcus's arm and sent him visions of the places she would travel and the wonders she would witness. And she promised to think of him whenever she saw beings caring for each other with kindness. Flair simply climbed into Marcus's lap one last time and radiated pure love in its most undiluted form. And Marcus held a young dragon while tears ran down his face. Aurelia told Marcus that her children would visit once per cycle to maintain the bond they had formed, and she would ensure he had everything needed to welcome them properly. Then she paused and looked at Marcus with something approaching curiosity, and she asked him why he had done this when he knew it would bring him nothing but trouble. Marcus thought about Sarah and the accident and the 5 years of grief. And he told Aurelia that caring for her children had given him purpose again and reminded him what it felt like to be needed. He said that was worth more than any treasure or power she could offer. And Aurelia's expression shifted to something that might have been respect, or might have been recognition of kinship across an impossible divide. She told him that humans were strange and often foolish, but occasionally they surprised even beings as old as her. And Marcus would be remembered in Stellarborn history as the small creature who taught a goddess about compassion. Then she and her children began to fade as reality reasserted itself around them. And the last thing Marcus saw was Ember's copper scales catching the light one final time. The apartment was empty and quiet, and Marcus sat on the floor surrounded by the nest that 3 young dragons had called home. And outside the window, the star pulse, once in what might have been acknowledgement or farewell power, returned to the station in a surge that made lights flare and systems reboot. And Marcus heard confused voices outside as people emerged from buildings, wondering what had happened. He stood slowly and looked around at his tiny apartment that had, if he was Auric. The morning after Aurelia's departure, Marcus opened his card as usual and tried to pretend the universe had not fundamentally shifted around him. But the evidence of change was everywhere for those who knew how to look, the star that warmed. Reach Station 7 now hung in the sky with a stability that made astrophysicists weep with joy because every measurement they took showed impossible perfection. And the solar fluctuations that had plagued the system for decades had vanished overnight. Station administrators received notifications from governments across the galaxy informing them that the system now fell under special protected status, and no military vessels would be permitted within its borders without explicit authorization from an authority that remained unnamed. Marcus served breakfast to confused dock workers who could not understand why the Resh traders were suddenly treating the station with religious reverence. And he smiled quietly while remembering the way Ember had perfected his flame control on those very same Grill's security officer. Lynn stopped by during her morning rounds, and she leaned against the counter with an expression that mixed suspicion with genuine concern. And she told Marcus that Fleet Command had abruptly withdrawn all ships from the system, citing new diplomatic protocols. She asked again what had really happened the night everything shut down, and Marcus considered telling her the truth before deciding some things were too vast for a casual explanation. And he said only that the lost children had been reunited with their mother. Lynn studied him for a long moment before shaking her head and muttering something about Marcus being the luckiest fool in the galaxy. And she walked away while Marcus returned to his prep work with hands that no longer shook. Days turned into weeks, and the station slowly returned to normal operations, though everyone noticed the changes that lingered like fingerprints on reality itself. And new planets appeared in the outer system where there had been only asteroids and ice survey. Teams reported that these worlds were perfectly suited for colonization with atmospheres and water and soil composition that seemed designed for biological life. And governments began the slow process of claiming territory. While Marcus kept his secrets, he renovated his cart with credits that appeared in his account from an untraceable source. And he expanded the menu to include dishes that required specialized preparation, because he knew his most important customers would return eventually. The renovated storage room became a proper kitchen with equipment capable of handling exotic materials and extreme temperatures. And Marcus installed reinforced flooring that could support weights far beyond human scale. 3 months passed, and Marcus settled into a new routine that felt both familiar and strange. And he found himself watching the sky during quiet moments, as if expecting to see 3 familiar shapes descending from the clouds. Then one evening, exactly 1 standard year after he first fed 3 hungry juveniles the air above, his cart began to shimmer with displaced energy, and Marcus looked up to see shapes that were simultaneously the same and completely transformed. Ember landed first, and he was now the size of a small cargo hauler with scales that gleamed like molten copper in the station lights. And his wings had developed into massive structures that could carry him between planets. Spark descended more cautiously, and her bronze scales had taken on patterns that resembled circuit diagrams made of living metal. And the static electricity that danced along her body could power the entire station for Week's flare arrived last with his typical clumsiness despite his increased size, and his golden scales now contained depths that seemed to hold actual starlight, and his eyes reflected nebulae and distant galaxies. Marcus stood frozen with spatula in hand while three massive dragons that could level cities arranged themselves around his cart as if they were still the awkward juveniles he remembered, and the empathic pulse that hit him nearly drove him to his knees. Joy and affection and remembered safety washed over him in waves that carried the weight of cosmic distances traveled and responsibilities shouldered. And Marcus felt tears running down his face as he realized they had come home. Ember lowered his massive head and pressed it gently against Marcus's chest the way he used to, and the rumbling purr that emerged from his throat made the ground vibrate beneath their feet. Spark coiled her serpentine body around the cart protectively and sent Marcus visions of the stellar nurseries she had visited and the solar storms she had learned to navigate. And through it all, she had remembered the human who made her feel safe. Flare bounded forward with puppy-like enthusiasm despite being large enough to crush the cart, and he projected pure happiness at seeing his human again. And Marcus laughed while trying to avoid being accidentally squashed by affectionate dragon. Other beings on the station had stopped to stare at the spectacle, and Marcus saw Security Officer Lynn standing nearby with her hand on her stun baton, and he waved to indicate everything was under control. The juveniles had brought gifts, and Ember carefully deposited a chunk of crystallized starlight that pulsed with its own internal radiance, and Marcus accepted it with shaking hands while understanding he now possessed a power source that could run his cart for centuries. Spark offered him metals harvested from the core of a dead world, and each piece sang with strange harmonics when touched. And Marcus knew without being told that these materials could be forged into tools or structures that would never break or decay. Flare's gift was a collection of stories preserved in crystalline matrices, and when Marcus touched them, his mind filled with visions of wonders beyond human comprehension. And he saw the juveniles learning to swim through stellar coronas and dance in solar wind. Marcus fed them the special meals he had prepared using the exotic ingredients he had been stockpiling, and he watched in delight as the now massive dragons savored each bite with the same enthusiasm they had shown his younglings. They stayed for 3 days, and Marcus closed his cart to spend time with them properly, and they shared experiences that bridged the gap between human and cosmic perspectives. Ember showed him how to read the language of stars and understand the slow conversations that played out across light years. And Marcus gained appreciation for timescales that made human lifespans seem like eye blink. Spark taught him to see the patterns of energy that flowed through all things, and Marcus learned that reality was far more flexible than human science believed, and sometimes will and intent could shape the universe as surely as physical force. Flare simply wanted to hear human stories again, and Marcus spent hours telling him about Earth history and human mythology, and the small dramas that played out in everyday life. And the young dragon treasured these tales like precious gems. On the final day, before they had to leave, Aurelia herself appeared briefly in the sky above the station, and Marcus felt her attention focus on him like the beam of a lighthouse. Her voice spoke directly into his mind, and she thanked him again for protecting her children when they were vulnerable. And she told him that the system would remain under her guardianship for as long as stars burned. She offered him a final gift, which was the knowledge that his daughter Sarah had not truly died, but had simply moved to a different state of existence, and her consciousness now danced among the stellar winds where the Starbound could perceive her. Marcus wept openly at this revelation, and he asked if he could see her, and Aurelia gently told him that human perception was not equipped for such encounters, but Sarah was happy and at peace. The knowledge was enough, and Marcus felt a weight lift from his heart that he had been carrying since the accident. And he thanked Aurelia with genuine gratitude that transcended words. The juveniles departed with promises to return each year, and Marcus watched them ascend into the sky, trailing light like comets. And he knew his life had been forever changed by 3 hungry children who had wandered into his cart. Seeking snacks, word of the dragon's visit spread across the station, and soon the entire galaxy knew that. Reach Station 7 was home to the human who had befriended Stellabrum juveniles. And Marcus became a figure of legend. Whether he wanted the attention or not, diplomats began arriving to establish embassies in the protected system, and refugees from war-torn regions sought sanctuary under Aurelia's guardianship. And the station transformed from a minor waypoint into a thriving hub of peaceful cooperation. Marcus expanded his cart into a proper restaurant, and he hired staff to help with the increased business. But he always reserved 3 evenings per year when he closed to the public and prepared special meals on those nights. 3 massive dragons would descend from the sky, and the human who had fed them when they were small would welcome them home with open arms and a spread of food that combined human cuisine with cosmic ingredients.